These 5 wide receivers may have received a ton of volume last season, but their efficiency numbers were absolutely terrible. So now we need to try and decide, are their situations good enough and is the volume good enough for us to still use a top pick on them? Or do we need to be careful because the efficiency is going to make them super inconsistent once again? Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Today's video is about my top 5 wide receivers that saw the biggest volume in 2023, but saw the biggest drop when it came to how good their efficiency was last season. And we're gonna break down whether or not these guys are worthy of your draft picks and where their current ADP stands. But before we hop into it, you all gotta remember that right now, if you go on over to Underdog and you sign up using code word Headliners and you make at least a $10 deposit, you can get our 2024 fantasy football draft guide for free. And there really isn't a more perfect time for you to get signed up than right now. All you got to do is download the app, make a new account using code word Headliners, deposit at least $10. You're gonna get a deposit bonus. You're gonna get a special pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit, and you're also gonna get our draft guide. If you think watching these videos is keeping you ahead of your competition, just think about what our draft guide could do for you. All right, let's go ahead and jump into all the action. My biggest falling wide receiver from volume to efficiency last season, probably not that big of a shock to you, it's Devonte Adams. Last season, Devonte Adams saw a 27 spot drop from where he finished in his volume categories overall to where he finished in his efficiency categories overall. That is an absolutely insane drop, and you can see where he finished in the efficiency category. Some of the worst that he had last season. Yards per target, 31st. Yards per reception and yards after the catch per reception, 28th. Man, he was getting a lot of targets, but he didn't do anything with them. And when you take a look at the way that the Las Vegas offense operated last season, it's really not that big of a shock. And you can tie a lot of it to the quarterback position. Now, Devonte Adams did really well, obviously, in the volume. Second in overall targets, and his usage in the red zone was among the top in the league among wide receivers. And I know a lot of you out there hate Derek Carr, and sometimes I just don't get it. He's not the best quarterback in the world, but from a fantasy perspective, he's been just fine. But listen to these numbers. Listen to these splits when it comes to what Devonte Adams did with Derek Carr in 2022 to what he did last season. Because in 2022, Devonte Adams had 100 receptions on 179 targets. Now, there wasn't much of a difference in 2023 in those two areas. 103 receptions on 175 targets. But he went from just over 1,500 receiving yards in 2022 to only 1,100 in 2023, and his touchdowns dropped from 14 to 18. And again, the quarterback position is the biggest issue there. But if you want to draft Devonte Adams this season, you've got to take him as the wide receiver 13. And that puts his ADP right around 19th overall. And some people out there are going to argue, well, the starter is not going to be Aiden O'Connell, it'll be Gardner Minshew. And I would be absolutely fine with Gardner Minshew being his quarterback this season. And I don't necessarily agree with that. And here's the big reason why. Would Gardner Minshew be a little bit of a step up from what they had at the quarterback position last year? Potentially. There's no guarantee. But if you take a look at what he did last year in Indianapolis, and you're kind of using that as your argument for Gardner Minshew making Devonte Adams better, what about Michael Pittman? And just as a little side note, and spoiler, he'll come up in this video. Michael Pittman last season may have been one of the safer wide receivers in all of football, but he never had the volume. And if you take a look at the situation in Indianapolis last year compared to what they have in Las Vegas this year, I'm sorry. I would take what they had in Indianapolis last year over Las Vegas this season. I don't think Gardner Minshew is going to be quite the upgrade that a lot of you think. And I want to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. If you're drafting Devonte Adams at 19 overall as the wide receiver 13, are you okay with the numbers that Michael Pittman gave you last season? Because that right there may end up being Devonte Adams' ceiling. And if those numbers are his ceiling, his current ADP may not be worth it. As the 2023 season continued to roll on, I don't think a lot of people were super upset about what they were getting from Stefon Diggs. But then when we got towards the end of the season, it was like the dude completely disappeared when we needed him the most. After the bye week in week 13 last season, Stefon Diggs saw 4 straight performances where he finished 47th or lower in fantasy points among wide receivers. It wasn't until week 18 when he finished as the wide receiver 29 that he even gave you anything close to a fantasy performance. So it may not be a shock when you see that he dropped 19 spots from where he finished in volume to where he finished in efficiency. When it came to yards per target and yards per reception, among qualifiers last season, Stefon Diggs was one of the worst. And then when we got to points per touch, he also was not doing that well. Now, being 5th in targets, 6 in receptions, and 6 in receiving touchdowns may have taken away a little bit of the sting. But when it all comes together, at the end of the day, Stefon Diggs did not meet up to any expectations last season. And now his situation, while maybe on a potentially better team, he also is not going to see the consistent amount of volume that he saw last year. So can the efficiency get better? Now, I can tell you right now, the next video that I do, when I talk about the biggest risers from volume to efficiency, one of his teammates is going to be in that video, and we're going to be talking substantially about him. And Stefon Diggs is going to need to see some similar type of usage in 2024 because he's got a lot of weapons around him. You still have Nico Collins there. You still have Tank Dell, who should be healthy now after his offseason issues. And then you have Joe Mixon in the run game, who definitely can help out in the passing game. And oh yeah, don't forget about Dalton Schultz at tight end. There is going to be plenty of guys to get the ball to next season. And the numbers that we see in terms of his volume statistics could end up taking a pretty large hit. Now, if that happens, and his efficiency doesn't get better, Stefon Diggs could end up being one of the worst picks in all of fantasy football next year. But if he takes a hit in volume and his efficiency comes back to levels that we've seen before, he could end up being one of the savviest picks in football next season. And right now, maybe one of the lowest ADPs that we've seen for him in quite some time, because right now he would be the wide receiver 22 off your board. And that would mean you would have to draft him right around 29th overall. So you're going to be taking him in round 3. And that becomes a concern for me because if you're drafting him towards the beginning of round 3 and you went running back heavy to start, that means Stefon Diggs is going to have to be your wide receiver 1. But if you went wide receiver in the first round, running back in the second round, and now you're thinking about taking Stefon Diggs as your wide receiver 2, I just feel like there could end up being some potentially better options around him. So for Stefon Diggs, it all boils down to what his ADP will be come draft season. Now again, the ADPs that I'm giving you right now are over on Underdog, and that's for best ball, and those don't translate well when it comes to how we draft and redraft leagues. But at least right now, we're getting a little bit of an idea of what people think about him so we can gauge his value come redraft season. In redraft leagues, it becomes way more of a consistency problem for Stefon Diggs if he's not getting the type of volume that we need on a week-to-week basis. It's the same reason why I love Nico Collins, but I don't love him at his ADP right now. Yeah, you're going to get some really big games out of him, but there's going to be some weeks where you get absolutely nothing just because there's so many people to get the ball to. Stefon Diggs may blow up one week. Week 2 could end up being Nico Collins. Week 3 could be Tank Dell. Week 4 could be Dalton Schultz. You never know who is going to be the main receiver in any given week for the Houston Texans. As a whole, that offense is going to be a ton of fun to watch, and I can't wait to see the type of fantasy points they all put up. But on a week-to-week basis, it's going to be really hard to pick and choose who the guy will be. Okay, Okay, I think we can all agree that seeing Calvin Ridley on this list is absolutely no shock to anybody, because if there was a face of inconsistency at the wide receiver position last year, it was Calvin Ridley. And it makes sense considering he saw a 17 spot drop from where he finished in volume categories to where he finished for efficiency categories. His finishes last season in yards after the catch per reception and catch percentage were among the worst when it came to qualified starters last year. And even though he was doing a pretty decent job in terms of his big playability, yards per target was not that great of an area either. And he did end up finishing 6th in receiving touchdowns, which was good. And just like Devonte Adams, he also saw a pretty high target percentage when it came to his red zone usage. But now Calvin Ridley is in a new place with a new quarterback. And really, Calvin Ridley's value is going to be tied to what you think Will Levis is going to do for the Tennessee Titans. And this season, the hype on Calvin Ridley is not as big as it was last year. His draft position is going to put you right around wide receiver 35 and be the 59th overall pick in your draft. And last season, he did have to deal with a couple of guys who were considered primary targets over him, like Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram. And heading into 2024, he's going to have to kind of deal with the same thing when it comes to DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins, when Will Levis took over, had some pretty decent games. He had some big games, in fact. There was a lot of inconsistencies, and if Will Levis takes that next step, he absolutely could be a guy that can get the ball down the field to both of these receivers. But since DeAndre Hopkins already has the connection with Will Levis, that might be where he goes to first, and Calvin Ridley still sees some of those same inconsistencies as before. It may also be important to note that the run game in Tennessee with Tajay Spears and Tony Pollard may not be as strong as it was last season when they had Travis Etienne in Jacksonville. And then, I know Trevor Lawrence was not all that good last season, but was what he did last season going to be better or worse than what Will Levis can do this year? So as of right now, I'm going to tell you the same thing about Calvin Ridley for 2024 that I told you for 2023. To me, he's more of a best ball candidate. He's a guy that is going to have some big games and disappear in other games. Last season, on a percentage basis, Will Levis threw the ball 20 or more yards down the field more than any other quarterback in the NFL. And that is really good for Calvin Ridley. But the consistency and his accuracy and how many targets he ends up getting will be the deciding factor on whether or not he's a boom or bust player that you never know when you're going to put into your lineup, or he's a consistent producer that's going to have really big games and still put together some decent floor to go with it. In best ball leagues, his current ADP isn't all that bad, as long as you're not taking him as one of your main wide receivers. In redraft leagues, though, at that current ADP, I'm 100% passing. The most expensive player on this list is 100% going to be Garrett Wilson, who saw a 12-spot drop from his volume to efficiency last season, and it makes perfect sense given how big of a mess that offense was. And it all was not his fault, but from an efficiency standpoint, yards per target, yards per touch, and catch percentage, all finishing 30th or worst among qualifiers. And even when you take a look at like catch percentage, how many of those targets were realistically not catchable? But that wasn't for a lack of trying, because the Jets absolutely tried to put the ball in their playmakers' hands. 4th in targets last season, and definitely was looked at about mid-range among the wide receivers that we've talked about in terms of his overall volume. But Garrett Wilson right now is going to cost you a first-round pick. His ADP sits at 10th overall, and he's the wide receiver 8 off the board in underdog drafts. Everybody's buying into him becoming an absolute playmaker with Aaron Rodgers this season, as long as Rodgers can stay healthy. And I don't hate it. I absolutely understand why. If there is anybody on this list that I would be willing to buy into for 2024 at their current ADP, it would be Garrett Wilson. Now, that doesn't mean that at his current ADP that I wouldn't invest in a running back before him in redraft leagues, or there may not be a couple of wide receivers around him that I would rather have. But Garrett Wilson is a really good bet to bounce back this season, given how poor that offense was last year and how he was still a focal point of the targets. Just know that if Aaron Rodgers goes down for any reason, things are going to get tough again. So you're really not buying into Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson is fabulous. You're buying into the quarterback position, and if old man Rodgers can get back some of that magic that he had while he was in Green Bay. All right, our final player that we're going to be talking about today is Michael Pittman. And you might look at it as a negative that he is on this list. He did see a 10-spot drop when it went from volume to efficiency. But really, when you take a look at the total stats that we've talked about so far over the last couple of weeks, it was really a mixed bag of returns when it came to Michael Pittman. Because when it came to his worst categories, he did have 2 efficiency categories in there: points per touch and yards per reception. However, he did have a volume category in there as well, because in the red zone, he wasn't particularly used the way we would have liked. Now, for his best categories, 4th in receptions and 9th in targets. So clearly he did very well in the volume area. But then you take a look at catch percentage. He ended up finishing pretty high there as well in the efficiency section. So again, he had some really nice finishes in volume, but some really poor finishes in volume. He had some really poor finishes in efficiency and some really nice finishes in efficiency. And for me, Michael Pittman is the poster child for safe wide receivers. I know a lot of people are concerned because, well, Anthony Richardson wasn't his quarterback last year, Gardner Minshew was. I am not worried at all about Anthony Richardson. Even in the games that Anthony Richardson did play, he was looking towards Michael Pittman consistently. His targets were still pretty high up there. He's going to see a nice amount of volume once again this year. And if we see a fully healthy Jonathan Taylor with Anthony Richardson in the backfield also fully healthy, defenses are going to have to try and stack the box, and they're going to have to pay extra attention to basically 2 elite runners in the backfield. Adonai Mitchell on the other side is a deep threat, and then Josh Downs over the middle of the field from the slot. He's going to have a really nice target share and a plus-plus situation this year. And right now, he's being drafted 32nd overall as the wide receiver 24 off the board. So you're looking at him as being your wide receiver 2, and I love him there. Now, in best ball leagues, I don't know if I'm loving that ADP. Because again, in best ball leagues, you're really looking for guys who have a high upside every single week. And Michael Pittman may not be that guy, and I don't think that's a bad thing when it comes to redraft leagues. Because in redraft leagues, if I'm drafting Michael Pittman as my wide receiver 2, and I know that his floor every single week is going to be wide receiver 2, I'm happy with that. Because yes, you got to have some upside, and if you draft a wide receiver 1 with really nice upside, then Michael Pittman fits in very, very well on your team. So absolutely, I'm buying into Michael Pittman once again this season. And maybe he's not a wide receiver 1 candidate, but if he gave me consistent wide receiver 15 through 24 numbers, he will absolutely make up for his ADP, and he will be one of your best investments of the offseason. Well, there you go, Headliner Nation. My biggest fallers in wide receivers when it came from their volume to their efficiency. And next week, you're definitely going to see a video on the biggest risers from volume to efficiency, and there's going to be some really good names in that one. So if you're new here, subscribe and stick around for that content. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button for me and turn on the bell notification so anytime we go live or drop new content, you'll know about it right away. And YouTube is going to recommend one of our last videos to you. Make sure you check that out if you've missed it. Peace out, Headliner Nation. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.